Have you ever stood near a highway and heard a truck coming before you could see it? Not just the rumble of any diesel, but a specific sound, a voice, so distinctive that the people who grew up around these machines could name the engine without ever looking under the hood. That kind of sound doesn't come from a spec sheet. It comes from engineering choices that were never meant to sound special, but ended up creating something unmistakable. Some of these engines screamed, some of them growled. A few of them shook the ground hard enough that you felt it in your teeth. Today, you're about to meet the 10 best-sounding diesel engines in American history, ranked from great to legendary. And the engine sitting at number 1? Its sound is so iconic that people still argue about whether anything built since has ever come close. Stick around for that one. Number 10. The Cummins VT903. Have you ever heard a diesel engine and thought it sounded more like a sports car than a truck? That's the Cummins VT903. Built by Cummins, starting in the late 1960s, this 8-cylinder V8 displaced about 14.8 liters, roughly 7 times the size of your average car engine. And it packed that displacement into a surprisingly compact block. The 903 was different from every other Cummins of its era because it was a V8 in a world dominated by inline sixes. And that V8 configuration gave it something no inline could match: a deep, rhythmic, almost muscular exhaust note that rose and fell with a cadence closer to a big block gas engine than a typical diesel. It had a natural rumble at idle that turned into a full-throated roar under load. In turbocharged form, the VT903 pushed out anywhere from 300 to 500 horsepower, depending on the application, and it found its way into military vehicles, heavy equipment, and some on-highway trucks. The guys who ran them in the Army remember the sound better than the specs. And here's the kicker. This engine powered the M60 Patton tank during the Cold War, which means thousands of American soldiers heard this exact exhaust note in places most people will never see. It wasn't the most popular Cummins ever made, but it might have been the most distinctive sounding V8 diesel to ever come out of Columbus, Indiana. If the 903's rumble impressed you, the next engine on this list made its name with a sound that was less of a growl and more of a deep, rolling thunder. Number 9. The Cummins KTA-600. Ready for an engine that sounded like the earth was clearing its throat? The Cummins KTA-600 was a monster by any standard. Built on Cummins K-Series platform, starting in the 1970s, this inline 6 displaced 19 liters. For context, that's about the same volume as 2 full-sized car engines stacked together. At 600 horsepower and over 1,650 foot-pounds of torque, the KTA was the engine you called when the load was too heavy for anything else. But it wasn't just the power that made this engine memorable, it was the way it announced itself. The KTA had a deep, resonant exhaust tone that seemed to come from somewhere underground. At idle, it had a slow, heavy thump that shook the cab. Under throttle, it built into a rolling bass note that you could feel in your chest from 50 feet away. Drivers who ran KTAs on mountain routes in the Rockies will tell you that the sound of that engine pulling a loaded trailer up a grade was something that stayed with you. Mechanics respected the KTA because despite its size, it was mechanically straightforward. The engine alone weighed over 3,000 pounds, about as much as a small car. But you knew what you were getting. Owner-operators who spec'd a KTA weren't chasing fuel economy. They were hauling the loads that other engines turned down. Logging trucks in the Pacific Northwest, heavy haul rigs crossing the Rockies, oversized load specialists. The KTA was the engine those guys trusted when the weight got serious. Fun fact: the KTA platform was so overbuilt that some marine operators ran them past 30,000 hours before a major overhaul. That's nearly 3.5 years of continuous operation. The KTA wasn't flashy. It was massive, deep-voiced, and absolutely relentless. But if you think a big inline six is the only way to make a diesel sound incredible, the next engine on this list proves otherwise. Number 8. The Mack E9 V8. Some engines earn their reputation with power. This one earned it with attitude. The Mack E9 V8 was Mack's answer to every driver who wanted more muscle than an inline six could deliver. Built from the late 1970s through the early 2000s, the E9 was a 90-degree V8 displacing 16.4 liters. That's roughly 8 times the displacement of a standard sedan engine, packed into a V configuration that gave it a sound profile completely different from the inline sixes that dominated trucking. Where an inline six produces an even, smooth exhaust note, a V8 fires in an alternating pattern that creates a loping, syncopated rhythm. The Mack E9 took that V8 character and added the deep bass of a large-bore diesel. The result was a sound that was unmistakably Mack: heavy, authoritative, and just a little aggressive. At 500 horsepower and over 1,500 foot-pounds of torque in its later configurations, the E9 gave drivers serious pulling power wrapped in a package that sounded like nothing else on the interstate. The idle alone was worth the price of admission: a lazy, confident lope that you could hear through the walls of a truck stop diner. Crack the throttle, and it transformed into a full-bodied bark that bounced off highway barriers and told everyone within earshot exactly what brand of truck just went by. The guys who drove Mack Superliners with E9s under the hood talk about it with a loyalty that borders on religion. These were the drivers who identified as Mack guys first and truckers second. And here's something most people don't know. The E9's basic architecture was shared with Scania's V8 diesel, which is still in production today in Europe. The Mack V8 is long gone, but its DNA is still pulling loads on the other side of the Atlantic. If you liked the V8 rumble of the E9, the next engine is going to take you in a completely different direction, because it barely sounds like a diesel at all. Number 7. The Caterpillar 3406B. Imagine an engine so smooth that drivers swore it purred like a sewing machine. The Caterpillar 3406B was one of the most recognizable engines in American trucking, and a huge part of that recognition came from its sound. Introduced in the 1970s and produced through the early 90s, the 3406B was a 14.6-liter inline six, a big engine by any measure, about 7 times the displacement of a typical car. But what made it special was how refined it sounded for something that large. The 3406B had a tight, mechanical exhaust note with a characteristic cat whine underneath, a high-pitched singing from the timing gears that became a signature of Caterpillar engines. It was subtle at idle, but at highway RPM, that whine blended with the exhaust into something immediately identifiable. Experienced truckers could pick a 3406B out of a truck stop full of idling engines just by that sound alone. With 350 to 425 horsepower and a reputation for going well past 1 million miles, the 3406B became the backbone of American long-haul fleets in the 1980s. It wasn't the loudest engine in the world, but its sound was like a fingerprint. Once you learned it, you never forgot it. And here's the kicker. When CAT eventually replaced the B model with the electronically controlled E model, a lot of old-school drivers said the new engine didn't sound the same. They were right. The mechanical fuel injection of the B gave it a crispness that electronics smoothed away. And that's exactly why the B model is still the one people remember by ear. Pretty impressive for an engine that was never trying to be loud, right? Well, the next one on this list was definitely trying to be loud, and it succeeded. Number 6, the Detroit Diesel 8 V92. Think a diesel engine can't make your hair stand up? The Detroit Diesel 8 V92 was built to prove you wrong. This was Detroit's big two-stroke V8, displacing just under 12 liters, and it was the turbocharged successor to the earlier 71 series. Here's the thing about two-stroke diesels. Where a normal four-stroke engine fires each cylinder once every 2 rotations of the crankshaft, a two-stroke fires every single rotation. That means double the exhaust pulses at any given RPM, which makes a two-stroke diesel sound like it's spinning twice as fast as it actually is. The 8V92 took that principle and cranked it up. With twin turbos feeding the Roots blower, this engine produced a layered wall of sound. The scream of the blower on top, the rapid-fire exhaust pulses in the middle, and a deep mechanical clatter underneath. At full throttle, it was one of the most aggressive sounds in trucking. In its hottest configurations, the 8V92 pushed out over 500 horsepower. Drivers who ran them loved the instant throttle response. You pushed the pedal, and the power was right there. No lag, no waiting. The trade-off was fuel economy that made accountants cry, and oil consumption that would embarrass most four-strokes. But nobody ran an 8V92 because they were worried about fuel bills. They ran it because nothing else on the road made them feel like that. And here's something wild about the 8V92. It was so loud that some municipalities specifically wrote noise ordinances targeting trucks that ran them. That's right. Cities literally passed laws because of how this engine sounded. If the 92 made you feel something, the next engine on the list is going to turn the volume up even further. Number 5, the Cummins N14. A lot of people would put this one higher on the list, and honestly, they'd have a good argument. The Cummins N14 was the last of the great mechanical Cummins engines, a 14-liter inline-six that bridged the gap between the old-school mechanical era and the electronic future. Built from 1985 through 2002, the N14 delivered up to 525 horsepower in its factory configurations, with some tuned versions pushing well past that. But the sound is what made the N14 unforgettable. At idle, it had a deep, even lope that was smoother than most big diesels of its era. Under load, the exhaust opened up into a clean, muscular roar, with a turbo whistle sitting just behind it. Hit the Jake brake coming down a mountain, and the N14 produced one of the most satisfying engine braking sounds in all of trucking. Deep, staccato bark that echoed off rock walls and announced your presence long before anyone could see you. What made the N14 special was that it sounded powerful, without sounding harsh. There was a refinement to its voice that the older engines on this list don't have. Mechanics loved it because the 3 separate cylinder heads made field repairs far simpler than most competitors. You could pull one head without disturbing the other two, which meant a roadside repair that would take all day on other engines could be wrapped up in hours. The engine had its flaws. Head gasket issues at higher power ratings, some oil consumption, but the people who ran them at 460 to 500 horsepower swear they were among the most dependable engines ever bolted into a frame. More power than a Detroit and better fuel economy than a Cat. That was the pitch, and for a lot of drivers, it delivered. And here's something most people don't know. The N14 became so popular in the truck simulator gaming community that sound modders travel the world recording real N14s just to capture the exhaust note for their digital recreations. An engine so good sounding that people pay money to hear a virtual version of it. If you think it's hard to top the N14, the next 4 engines on this list have sounds that are so deeply burned into American trucking history that some drivers refuse to believe anything newer will ever match them. Number 4. The Caterpillar 3406E. Ever heard a diesel engine that sounded angry? The Caterpillar 3406E was the electronically controlled evolution of the B model we talked about earlier. And while some purists mourned the loss of the mechanical fuel system, the E model developed a voice all its own. The same 14.6-liter inline-six, but now with electronic unit injectors that gave it a slightly different character, tighter, sharper, and with more authority in the mid-range. The 3406E produced up to 550 horsepower in its factory ratings, and plenty of owner-operators had them tuned well beyond that. The cat growl was still there, and so was that signature timing gear whine. But the E model added something the B never quite had, a crispness under heavy throttle that sounded like the engine was leaning into the work. And the Jake brake on the E model was where this engine truly came alive, because the electronic unit injectors operated at much higher pressures than the old mechanical setup. The engine brake on a 3406E was dramatically more aggressive than its predecessor. The sound was a deep, ripping bark that could be heard from half a mile away, and in the mountains, it echoed through valleys like rolling thunder. Drivers who ran 3406Es through the Appalachians or the Cascades made the Jake brake part of their identity. Some deliberately ran open pipes just to let the world hear it. And here's the thing that really separates the 3406E from everything else. When Caterpillar left the on-highway market in 2010, the sound of a Cat diesel disappeared from American highways almost overnight, and people noticed. They noticed because nothing else on the road sounded like a Cat. And the 3406E was the engine they missed the most. People are still paying premium prices for trucks with these engines, long after the last one rolled off the line. That tells you everything about what that sound was worth. Think the Cat E was something special? The next 3 engines on this list have sounds that didn't just define a truck, they defined entire eras of American trucking. Number 3, the Detroit Diesel 6V71. This engine didn't just have a sound, it had a war cry. The Detroit Diesel 6V71 was the engine that put General Motors' diesel division on the map, and for decades, it was the most common sound in American commercial transportation. Introduced in 1957 as the V configuration of the legendary 71 series, the 6V71 was a 2-stroke diesel with a Roots-type supercharger, a mechanical blower that forced air into the cylinders because a 2-stroke diesel can't breathe on its own the way a 4-stroke can. That blower is where the magic happened. At idle, The 6V71 produced a distinctive loping hunt, a rhythmic surging that sounded like a heartbeat. Rev it up, and the blower whine climbed into a scream that gave the entire 71 series its famous nickname, the Screaming Jimmy. That whine layered over the rapid-fire two-stroke exhaust created something that sounded like no other diesel on Earth. With around 270 to 300 horsepower in typical truck configurations, the 6V71 wasn't the most powerful engine on the road, but it was everywhere. Buses, trucks, boats, generators, construction equipment. For millions of Americans, the sound of a Screaming Jimmy was the sound of their city, their commute, their job site. It drank oil like it had a personal vendetta against your maintenance budget. And keeping one happy required a driver who understood that this engine rewarded attention and punished neglect. A veteran knew to keep the RPMs up where the power lived. A rookie who tried to lug one would learn that lesson exactly once. Here's something wild. At one point, the 71 series in all its configurations powered nearly every city bus in America. That means an entire generation of Americans grew up with the sound of a Screaming Jimmy as the background music of their daily lives, whether they knew it or not. The 6V71 wasn't just an engine with a great sound. It was the soundtrack of mid-century America. And still, two engines remain that sound even more iconic. Ready to continue? Number 2. The Caterpillar C15. If you've ever stood near the front of a Peterbilt 379 or a Kenworth W900 and heard a big cat come to life with open pipes, you know exactly why this engine is sitting at number 2. The Caterpillar C15 was the last great cat truck engine, a 15.2-liter inline-six that produced up to 625 horsepower in its most aggressive factory ratings and considerably more when tuned. It was the successor to the 3406E, and while it carried forward that legendary cat DNA, the C15 had its own voice, deeper than the 3406, fuller, more chest-rattling. The C15 had a low-frequency exhaust note that seemed to vibrate the air around it, and under load, it built into a sustained, powerful roar that communicated raw authority. The turbo whistle on a C15 was more prominent than on the older cats, a rising, almost musical pitch that complemented the deep exhaust rather than competing with it. And the Jake brake? The C15's engine brake was arguably the best-sounding retarder in the history of trucking. 3 stages of progressively louder, deeper, more aggressive braking that could slow 80,000 pounds of truck and trailer down a mountain grade while producing a sound that people literally pulled over to listen to. Owner-operators who spec'd a C15 with a set of 8-inch straight pipes weren't just making a performance choice, they were making a statement. The sound was the brand. You heard that engine, and you knew exactly what kind of truck and what kind of driver was behind the wheel. When Cat left the highway engine business, C15-powered trucks became collector's items almost overnight. Prices climbed instead of falling. And a well-maintained glider kit with a C15 still commands serious money today. The C15 was the last chapter in Caterpillar's on-highway story, and its sound is the reason people still mourn that the chapter ended. It was, by almost any measure, the most beloved-sounding production truck engine of the modern era. But one engine sits above it on this list. And if you know anything about diesel history, you might already know which one it is. Number 1. The Detroit Diesel 671. There is one sound in American diesel history that stands above everything else. One engine whose voice is so deeply embedded in the memory of every trucker, every mechanic, every kid who ever sat on the shoulder of a highway and watched the big trucks roll by, that it has become the defining sound of an entire industry. The Detroit Diesel 671. Introduced in 1938, the inline six-cylinder version of General Motors' revolutionary 71 series, 426 cubic inches of displacement, about 7 liters, with a bore of 4¼ inches and a stroke of 5 inches. Those numbers sound modest by today's standards, but what came out of this engine was anything but modest. The 671 was a 2-stroke diesel, and like its V-configured siblings, it used a Roots-type supercharger to force air into the cylinders. But where the V models scattered that sound across 2 banks, the inline 6 focused it into a single, unified voice. At idle, the 671 produced one of the most recognizable sounds in mechanical history: a deep, loping thump underneath a chattering valve train with the blower whine sitting just above it like a high harmony. It sounded alive. It sounded like it was breathing. Rev it toward its operating range of around 2,000 revolutions per minute, and the exhaust note doubled in apparent speed, because in a 2-stroke, every revolution is a power stroke, which meant the 671 at 2,000 RPM sounded like a 4-stroke spinning at 4,000. That's where the Screaming Jimmy nickname was born. That climbing, urgent, almost desperate scream of the blower and exhaust combined into something no 4-stroke diesel has ever replicated. The 671 produced around 165 horsepower in its original commercial form and up to 225 in its Navy-rated wartime configuration. By modern standards, those numbers are tiny, but it was never about the numbers. It was about what this engine did to the world. During World War II, General Motors produced 62,000 671s in a single year, 1944 alone. They powered landing craft, tanks, trucks, ships, and earth-moving equipment across every theater of the war. After the war, the 671 became the dominant engine in American transit buses, and for decades, the sound of a Jimmy was the sound of every city bus in the country. It powered fishing boats, tugboats, generators, and logging trucks. Production ran for 57 years, from 1938 to 1995. Hundreds of thousands of these engines were built, and an astonishing number of them are still running today. Now, the 671 was not a perfect machine. It consumed oil at a rate that would horrify any modern fleet manager. The maintenance schedule was demanding. You could not neglect a 2-stroke Detroit and expect it to forgive you. And by the time emissions regulations caught up, the 2-stroke design simply couldn't comply. The engine didn't fail, the world changed around it, and no amount of cast iron could stop that. But the sound never changed. And that sound, that specific combination of blower whine, 2-stroke clatter, and deep exhaust pulse, became the most iconic voice in the history of the American diesel engine. Take a second and listen. If you've heard it before, you already know. And if this is your first time, you'll understand in about 3 seconds why this engine sits at the top of this list. There is no other diesel engine in American history that more people can identify by sound alone. The 671 is the voice of American diesel power, and nothing built before or since has ever sounded quite like it. From deep V8 rumbles to the unmistakable scream of a 2-stroke Jimmy, the engines on this list prove that diesel power isn't just about numbers, it's about character. These machines had voices, real, distinctive, impossible to fake voices that the people who worked with them will carry in their memory forever. So which engine on this list do you think we ranked wrong? Which one should have been higher? And if there's an engine we left off entirely that you think belongs here, drop it in the comments. We want to hear it. If you ever drove behind one of these engines, wrenched on one at 3 in the morning, or just heard one thunder past you on the highway, that's exactly the kind of story we want to hear below. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe and hit the bell. We've got new videos every week exploring the most incredible engines and machines ever built. See you in the next one.